Well, taking a look around the state, a measure that would have required each school bus in Louisiana to have air conditioning and heating has failed to pass the state legislature. SB 26, written by Louisiana Congressional District 6 candidate and current state senator Cleo Fields, would have required the governing authority of public and non-public elementary and secondary schools to equip all new or used school buses with passenger compartment heating and air conditioning systems. The measure would have mandated the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education to adopt those rules. Those in opposition included State Representatives Mike Johnson, Gabe Furman, and Chuck Owen, who represent parts of Rapides, Grant, and Vernon parishes. Respectively, State Reps Ed Lavardane and the third, and Rhonda Butler and Darrell DeSotel voted in favor of the measure. KLB reported in August of 2023 that over 100 buses across 4 Sinla school districts went without air conditioning.